The Bear Roar Special Edition series, Bandwidth, serves as a platform to celebrate the people and stories of Dan's book, Bandwidth, the Untold Story of Ambition, Deception, and Innovation that shaped the internet age and the dot-com boom. The story covers the epic journey of the creation of the internet backbones, the building of the early competitive fiber networks in the 1990s, the bandwidth boom, bust, and resurrection, ending in 2020 when Dan's company, Zayo, was sold. The book is available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble with a February 2025 release date. Head to dan-caruso.com/book for more details. In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan sits down with Kevin O'Hara, co-founder and CEO of Congruex, a telecommunications company dedicated to digital connectivity. Kevin shares his career journey from working in Alaska for Kiewit Construction to Metropolitan Fiber Systems in Chicago, where he took a chance on a bellhead and hired Dan. They reflect on their former late colleagues, Royce Holland and MFS and Level 3 CEO Jim Crow. Dan and Kevin discuss their leadership roles at Level 3, their driving motivations for success, and what the future holds for digital infrastructure with the rise of AI and quantum. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
All right, Kevin O'Hara. This is going to be fun. And I'm going to start with something that's a little bit maybe unexpected, but not a lot unexpected. I want you to talk about Royce Holland. Let's start with Royce Holland, because I know he meant a lot to you, he meant a lot to me, and he meant a lot to the industry. Tell us all about him.
So Royce was one of the best bosses I've ever had. Royce, when I went to work for him, had recently joined Kiewit from the energy business. He was doing power purchase agreements and building independent power plants. His skills actually would be very valuable today with what else is going on in the data center world and for what we're doing. But Royce was this good old boy from Texas. He had a bad haircut. He paid about $5 for that haircut, and he could afford a much better one. He had like $5 shoes with rubber soles. He always had shirts that probably needed to go to the dry cleaner. And it was so easy to underestimate him, but he was so smart. And he used that easy kind of Texas Hill Country, good old boy to his advantage many times during negotiations. Yep. On the personal side, he was just an awesome dude. To go off on maybe one of my all-time favorite Royce stories, we were having dinner somewhere in Boston. It was a very, very fancy restaurant. This is early on in my career. And Royce has that good old boy shucks thing going on. And we go to this fancy New England restaurant, and they come out and they say, "Would you like a cocktail before ordering?" And Royce said, "Well, I think I'll just have me a beer." And the guy was appalled. He says, "A beer? Yeah. In fact, save you a trip. Bring me 2 of them." And he could tell that the guy was not really so down with this. So when the guy brought him his 2 beers and he put a glass down, Royce gave him the glass back and said, "I won't be needing this." And the look on the guy's face was priceless. So there was a ton of great and funny Royce stories, but he was also smart as could be. He played a huge role in MFS. He played a huge role in his own business subsequent to that. And, I don't know if you know this, but Royce passed away also.
It happened in the March timeframe of this year, right?
Yeah. Way too young.
As I was going through the book and, just got done with the first very rough round of edits, that's when I heard he passed, and I was like, wow, I had a different relationship with him because I don't know that there was that much one-on-one time we spent together in aggregate. Maybe a little bit here, maybe a little bit there, but for the most part, it was me watching him and seeing him and observing him, and sometimes directly, sometimes even though we worked roughly in the same vicinity, it was different buildings, but I'd see him through the trade press and through kind of other lenses. And his one of the ways he inspired me was just how bold he was and how he would feel really comfortable just going out there and making a lot of noise about the need for competition in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the Telecom Act, Royce was probably, one of the most influential people from a competitive industry perspective in terms of the drafting of the Telecom Act. Yep. In fact, he came back the day it got signed, because Clinton's the one that signed it. He came back with a signed copy of the bill.
Oh, really?
From Bill Clinton, and it was one of his proudest moments. Which is very cool. In fact, it was on the cover. It was to Royce from Bill Clinton. Oh. So that was very cool. I have a terrible story about Royce. and Jim Crow, because I know that Jim was also somebody that was pretty influential in your career and your life. They had a falling out towards the end of MFS over what, I'm not exactly sure. But when we started level 3, I'm obviously working for Jim. I had a good relationship with Royce, and I ended up in the position sometimes of having to bridge between those. It never got too personal, but it was certainly stressful from a business standpoint. Well, fast forward to where the dot-com bubble has completely burst. And I'm drawing a blank on what was the name of Royce's CLEC?
Allegiance.
Allegiance had a huge managed modem contract for AOL. We were doing a lot of consolidation of managed modem platforms, as you recall at the time. And one of the companies...
for the listeners, managed modem is where in the early days of the internet, people would dial up, use their phones to dial into the internet, AOL, MSN, and otherwise. And one of the big contributions of MFS in that era was being kind of the wholesale provider that allowed the retail brands such as Yahoo and MSN and AOL to allow their customers to dial a phone number. We would intercept the call and push it through into the internet.
Yeah, that's a good catch.
Yeah.
I'll try to keep the industry jargon to a minimum, but
no, it's all right.
They're
going to love it.
to put it into perspective, at the beginning of level 3, there was a point in time where managed modem was about $600 or $700 million of annual revenue out of about an $800 or $900 million run rate.
And how much of that dropped to the EBITDA line?
And the EBITDA, they contributed about 500 of EBITDA when we were at a negative $1 billion. So it had an outsized impact on us. Well, we bought one of Royce's competitors that was reselling Allegiance's dial-up services for AOL. And AOL at the time was level 3's largest customer. And the fact of the matter is they weren't complying with the contract. There was a number of technical things that they had to measure, call completion rate or drop rate, stuff like that. And after we made the acquisition, there was a lot of pressure on us to clean up the service and improve the service to get it on par with what we were providing directly through our own platform. And ultimately, we weren't able to do it. Allegiance was very much on the brink. It was when times were really, really tough in telecom. And I finally made the decision that we were going to have to terminate it and move it onto our own network, knowing full well that if I did that, Royce was going to file for bankruptcy the next day. Mm-hmm. And I spent a lot of time talking to Jim about it. It was maybe one of the worst calls that I've ever had to make in my life. But I called Royce. I said, Royce, and we'd sent a lot of notices, so he was on notice. But I called him. I said, Royce, we're gonna pull the trigger. We're gonna terminate the contract for cause. And he didn't take it real well, which I expected. He filed literally the next day. And to say that strained our relationship would probably be a little bit of an understatement. He assumed that it was Jim all the way. And Jim, it wasn't Jim's call. It was my call. It was the right thing to do from a business perspective.
Oh, yeah.
But still really, really hard. But I waited a month and I called him and I said, Royce, let me come down to Texas and let me buy you dinner. Let me buy you a drink because this relationship
or two
or more. Our relationship goes back too far and too long for us to just walk away from each other. And to his credit, that was an easy call for me to make. It was a very hard call for him to take. And to his credit, he said, sure. And we went down and we had a really, really nice steak. We had more than 2 drinks. In fact, I lost count. But we buried the hatchet, and not a lot of people would be able to do that. No. Royce was he was that kind of a stand-up guy. He was amazing.
No, and it was, not too many people would have made the phone call that you made either, because in those days, as you know better than I things were happening in a fashion that you couldn't tell what the next shoe that was going to drop. Everyone was fighting for survival. The interlinkage between all the companies was maybe more profound than we as an industry fully understood. So when the dominoes started to fall, everyone was extraordinarily vulnerable, yet you didn't know when it was going to end or how it was going to end. So level 3 was fighting for its survival too in that era.
It was. In fact, Dan, we were doing a fundraise. It was the last fundraise before the dot-com bubble burst. but it was clearly like there was storm clouds on the horizon. We every time we would go out with an additional, especially if it was equity, if it was primary proceeds equity, we would always, I guess we're beyond the statute of limitations. Internally, we would always have a pool on where was our stock going to trade while we're out on the roadshow. Because if you're offering another X number of shares, you would typically expect to see some
Retreat.
downward pressure. And on this particular offering, we ended up both upping the size of the equity that we ultimately printed on, and we upped the size of our the bonds that we were trying to raise, and our stock price traded up during the roadshow.
And do you remember roughly when that would have been?
It was weeks or months before the NASDAQ kind of cratered.
Yeah. So bringing in all that fresh cash, if you'd have waited some period of time, maybe it was a month, maybe it was 3 months, but some relatively short period of time, there'd be zero chance of raising that money at any price.
And on the combination of that offering, I'm going from memory, it was $4.5 billion, $5 billion. And the difference between level 3 surviving and never having to file and filing was that $5 billion of cash. That is absolutely the delta. Because we got into the $5 billion before we were done. On that roadshow, I kept getting the same question. And one of the other funny, quirky things, we'll say, is whenever we raised money, Jim, and if it was Doug Bradbury or Cyril, whoever our CFO was at the time, they would typically go and ensconce themselves at like the Four Seasons in New York and stay there for a week and cover all the big guys in New York and do lunches and breakfast. I mean, you've done it like the roadshow, but they would do New York. And me and our treasurer, initially that was Cyril, later on it was Robin Gray, we would then fly the wings off our planes and hit every other market in the country. So Jim was always rested, had a nice dinner, and me and whether it was Cyril or whomever, we would just be exhausted at the end of this. But people started asking these questions, and the question overall was, aren't there too many of you guys, right? And on the flight from the East Coast to the West Coast for an early morning one-on-one the next day, I started listing all of the companies that had either already built a network, AT&T and MCI and Sprint, or had raised money to build networks, Level 3, Quest, or were in the process of it, Wiltel, Split Rock. When you added it up, there were 28 companies that had either completed their network or were in the process of completing a network. And it was one of those kind of oh shit moments, because I'd never added them up before. And I called Jim the next day and I said, I keep getting this question. He goes, yeah, I do too. I said, there's 28 of us. I said, that's the bad news. The good news is we all only need 10% market share to make it. And if you fast forward 2 or 3 years, of those 28 companies, there was only 2 of them that didn't have one of the following three things happen. File for bankruptcy, a material restatement of earnings, material restatement, or executives going to jail. The only 2 exceptions to that out of the 28 were Level 3 and AT&T. That statistic, more than anything, is
and AT&T
horrifying.
Barely, by the way. I guess Level 3 barely too. AT&T had its own. The only reason it survived was the wireless business, and that was really what saved it.
Well, and if you look at the separation, because ultimately SBC bought AT&T and stole the brand. They didn't steal it; they earned it. It was AT&T to this day is an amazing brand, but SBC paid less for AT&T, the company that at one point in time was the most valuable brand in the world, for less. They paid 2/3 of what WorldCom paid for MFS a couple years earlier. That is a staggering statistic. I mean, AT&T had fallen, but they didn't break the law, and they didn't go bankrupt. They just had lost their way, I think, commercially.
Yeah, when I was researching the whole AT&T story of that era, of which I knew it at a very high level, made a piece of it, but I went in a deep dive. The strategy on paper still to this day feels like the right strategy. We're AT&T, we got to get out of being a long distance. That's going to go away, but we got a ton of cash, and we're going to be the number one wireless provider. We're going to be the number one cable provider. We're going to acquire teleports, so we have kind of a fiber network to get to commercial. We're going to be really take our brand and be international. It was like they had all these things that they intended to do, and they did them all. They did them all in a pretty short order of time, and they did them all in a market environment where everything was extraordinarily expensive. And then they have to do, make sense of it afterwards, and they just got in way over their skis. But it was kind of a sign of the time sometimes where the strategy wasn't necessarily the problem. A lot of cases it was, especially the Me Too's. But it wasn't, the strategy that you look at on a piece of paper and say, wow, that makes sense to do that. It was all the noise in the system, all of the others who are kind of chipping away from different angles, and just unpredictability of what would happen next.
Um, I've spent a lot of time over the years, um, like over a lot of years, 20 years, 25 years, trying to think about why do some companies excel through turbulent times, and why do some really like kind of wither on the vine. AT&T at the end of the day was the ultimate monopoly utility. Um, they weren't a technology company. They weren't a services company. That's just not how they thought. They thought as a regulated utility. And we're going to see it again, by the way. I think they're not going to go broke, but we're going to see a similar disruption on the electrical side, which hopefully we get to down the road a little bit. But they had a leadership team that had never been really challenged before.
True.
I have a view that most executives and employees, for that matter, fall into one of two categories. You and I think we fall into the category of we love starting something or going to a place where they don't have a playbook because we get to write it. And we don't have to be constrained with how things have always been done, right? And you and I are different from most people at AT&T, where they love going to work in the morning and taking the playbook out of the drawer and going to their policy manual and their procedure manual. And when those businesses get turned on their rear, the reason, at least in my opinion, that they tend not to come out the back end stronger, and this is a broad generalization, is they don't have the thinking and mindset that an entrepreneur has. And even businesses that are really big anymore, but got started by entrepreneurs, and there's a ton of those around, that's different than going to work for AT&T prior to 1990 or 2000. Right? AT&T was still pretty staid in its existence and its operations.
Here's an interesting one in the era we live in right now. If 2 years ago you and I were sitting there and saying, boy, I think that Google's search engine is going to come under enormous market pressure in 2 years, the other one of us would look and say, what are you talking about? That Google's search engine is going to be here for 20 more years. They are, their cash flow machine is as secure as anything else out there. We both would have believed that. Now you fast forward 2 years, and with kind of the way AI is playing out, one of the early areas of pressure, I won't say victims of it, but areas of significant pressure, is the search engine. Why use Google when you can use one of these AI ones? And who would have thought that 2 years ago? And it'll be interesting with Google, who, this isn't a critique of Google per se, but they certainly are in the category of things have gotten pretty easy for them. In the last 10 years, they've had a cash flow machine that's funded all kinds of other stuff. They could have made enormous mistakes. It wouldn't really matter. They could have lots of employees, paid lots of money, working from wherever, and they always had the search engine and the revenue associated with it. But now that they're going to be under pressure at the core of where their cash flow machine is, will they have the muscle to respond to that, or will they find out that maybe they're not that much unlike AT&T was 30 years ago?
Yeah, and I would take it even beyond Google. I mean, when you use technology to, in their case, they created a market, right? So that's a little bit different. But when you use technology to disrupt a market, and you could have the best technology in the history of the world, and almost by definition, if you're disrupting a market, you must have something special. What leads you to believe that somebody smarter than you isn't going to come along in 10, 20, 30 years and disrupt you? So I'm not saying which one of these it's going to happen to, but when you look at Microsoft, Google, we used to call them the FANGs, Amazon, it's naive to think in 20 or 30 years, these guys are still going to dominate the world. Some of them might, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if, because technology in particular is so unpredictable. That's what is amazing about it in some ways, but it's what's scary about it in others. I think that a number of those companies are going to see pressure. I don't see anything that causes that pressure in the next year or two.
Oh, I don't know.
But if I look at 10 or 20 or 30 years, I can definitely see a lot of pressure.
I don't know with what's going on with AI. They're all, there certainly have been big winners in AI based on the market caps that have jumped up. But are all of them going to stay big winners?
No.
Or will some of them and some that fall down? And the events of the next year or two are going to be very influential to that. And who would have thought that we're now not talking about 4 or 5 of them, we're talking about 7 of them, and there's 2 new additions to that conversation that even a year ago, I mean, NVIDIA was a strong company, but we wouldn't have thought of NVIDIA as, in that camp of companies. And we certainly want to talk about a brand new entrant as being a significant player at that level, which OpenAI certainly is in that, rapidly being in that category.
Yeah. So on that front, I agree with you. Where I was coming from in the next couple year horizon is these guys are such cash machines. They may come up with some brilliant strategy where they realize they're not winning there and they pivot or whatever. But even if they don't, they got enough cash to kind of make it a few years off their core products.
Although, again, reflecting back on AT&T, which got us on here, if you look at AT&T circa 1996, 1995, they had almost no debt, a whole bunch of cash, and they were a cash flow machine. In hindsight, you can look back and yeah, but now that we know how the story played out the next handful of years, they weren't as strong a position as they would have looked. But at that point in time, I mean, net debt literally was 0, which is crazy.
Yeah.
And gross debt was very little, cash was very high, and cash flow machine was very strong. But then everything attacked them from different angles, and they were just unprepared.
Yeah, no, a point is well taken. Then go back to my earlier point, or I'll go back to my earlier point. A lot of that is because they had people that didn't know how to respond in a super competitive market. And in that time frame, you're talking about 95, 96, it was a hyper competitive marketplace.
Yeah.
A lot of puppies nipping at their heels as some of those puppies were going to grow up to be big dogs.
So you talked about power companies. When we go there now, how do you see that analogy playing out?
So there's a there for Congruex.
And people heard a little introduction early on, but tell a little bit more about Congruex. What is it? How'd you get involved with it? Partners, what's that business all about?
So I'll go back a step further to how I started my career. I started my career working for Kiewit, a very large construction company, doing large industrial projects. I worked in Alaska on the pipeline, technically in Prudhoe Bay.
And how old were you when you started working with Kiewit? Because you were young.
19. I was 19.
So 19 joins Kiewit. There's a little bit of a lottery. Everyone says, there's always a debate how much is what people who've done well. Certainly luck plays a role, but what role does luck play? And I was in a one-on-one conversation with someone at Denver AI Week where I was kind of interviewing them, and he was a very talented person, did very well, and he was underplaying the aspect of luck and relative to how I would say it, and just saying those who really are great, they make their own luck, they earn their luck. And I'm like, I don't know. I look back at my career and I could name 5 or 6 kind of forks in a road where it was at best 50-50 that I ended up on the good versus the bad. And most of it was happenstance, including you not ignoring the resume when my name was on it. But there were multiple events like that I could have easily been still living in Chicago, like most of my family that still does, in some kind of company in a boring industry, and wondering when I'm going to retire. And I think you do have to. Luck doesn't make people successful, but certainly you need items of luck along the way in order to kind of accelerate what you're able to do.
Oh, Dan, I couldn't agree with you more. I used to describe it, and somebody said it's actually more about serendipity. Serendipity being you're in the right place at the right time, but you knew what to do about it, right? You knew that this was something worth grabbing onto. So, my father was an orphan. He grew up in England. I grew up in England, and he refused to accept that status. So he became a union electrician. He was an only child. He did not grow up in a supportive environment. A very, very poor part of England, and he put himself through night school to become an electrical engineer, and ultimately brought his family to the promised land, America. Because back then, the view, if you're in England, and we're talking in the 60s, is everybody in America has a TV and a swimming pool, right? It's actually pretty far from that, but relative to where we came from, it was pretty amazing. So I grew up thinking that you worked until you're 65 and then you got a pension and you're retired. And I take this job in Alaska, which was a punishment, by the way. I was not a good student up until that time. I was actually a poor student, but a good hockey player. I was very good business for the local beer distributor on campus. And I was just kind of skirting through school because I didn't know what I wanted to do per se. And just seemed like the natural next step. I was studying electrical engineering. When I got that job at Kiewit, I got a level of responsibility that I wouldn't have expected at 19. And I started talking to people and learning about how the Kiewit company operated. That literally was life. It was a life-altering moment for me, where I said, "This is what I want to do." And when I went back to school, I got much more serious about school. I didn't want to get thrown out. I think I was on academic probation at the time. So it was amazing that it happened at 19. The more amazing thing that happened at 19, and Dan, this has happened to you as well. I know it for a fact. Somebody saw in me something different and unique. And in most big companies, you've got a natural career progression. And, you go from this job to that job to that job to that job. In my case, while I was 19, I got pulled out of line. And it was because I had responded to a problem that we were having in a way that nobody expected. It was, looking back, it was kind of silly. I'm surprised my boss didn't fire me. But the big boss valued that. He valued what I had done. And the next thing you know, Walter Scott, who was our chairman, he was the CEO and chairman of Kiewit at the time. He came to Alaska with his family to do a job tour. This is a place where we're working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day in the Arctic, way up in the Arctic, on an oil field. It's dirty. It's nasty. The work is hard. And we're having to sweep out the trailers. And there was no drinking allowed on the oil field, and we're bringing in cases of booze. And Walter shows up, and we're supposed to go and pick up Walter and his family from his jet. And we're getting our debrief before we go. And I was a co-op student, I'm the guy that's got to take my truck over after everybody gets off the plane, and the project manager takes them to camp or to the job site, whichever we were going to first. And I was to wait until everybody was gone, and then pull my pickup truck up and get all the luggage, and then go and put it in the guest quarters at the camp. So I say, well, so when you say Walter and his family, who's coming? Well, it's his wife and his daughter, and the ratio up there was like 400 to 1 men to women. Right? You're working a lot, you're twitching a lot. I haven't seen a girl in 4 months, and I go, well, how old's his daughter? And that got me off luggage duty. And somebody else was sent to get the luggage. But that evening, while we were at the camp, I went up to Walter. Again, I was naive. And I just said, Walter, what does the chairman and CEO do? And he says, well, why do you ask? I said, because I didn't know that people could have their own jet. And I didn't know, I don't know what you do, but we had to clean the floors, and we had to wash our trucks, and we were told how to act and not act. So I just think that
did they tell you not to ask questions?
And no, and they said you must be really important. And I started to think, I'd like to have a plane, and I'd like people to have to clean the office before I show up. So I'd like to do what you do. And Walter thought this was like the funniest thing ever. And obviously, this is a paraphrase of what the conversation was, but I honestly didn't know what they did, and I didn't know that you could have a jet. And that is where I started to think, I think I'd rather have a jet, right? This whole working for a pension thing probably not going to cut it for me. And that began my journey. But fast forward, I graduated from school.
So you could have just got together with his daughter, fall in love, got married, and you'd had that jet a lot earlier in life.
Yeah, it was. So I've made good decisions generally on the relationship side, but that's one it may have been a missed opportunity. So I ended up working on a bunch of industrial projects. We got building a power plant in Thule, Greenland. I spent my 25th birthday, which is in January, at the very top of Greenland, which is not where you want to be in January.
Is there a time of year you do want to be there?
No, but you definitely don't want to be there in January. So I got to do a lot of cool stuff. But then fiber optics came along. When AT&T got broken up in 1984, AT&T used to own all of the technology that they deployed in the network.
Yeah.
They had a division called Bell Labs and Western Electric. Bell Labs did a lot of the research. Western Electric did all the manufacturing. And at the time of the breakup, they had all of the foundational patents on fiber optic cable, the glass itself. They had all the foundational patents on transmitters, receivers, repeaters. They had everything you need to build a fiber optic network, and they had deployed 14 miles. It's because they only changed technology out at the end of an accounting life, right?
Yeah.
So they were measuring economic life rather than technological life. So Kiewit, being the good contractor, says, hey, all these new entrants are, that after the breakup, Western Electric and Bell Labs became an independent company, motivated to sell their technology. So we threw our hat in the ring to start building for people like Sprint and other new entrants. And then that led to Jim Crow deciding, after a lot of analysis, to invest in a company called Metropolitan Fiber Systems.
Which is originally Chicago Fiber
Chicago
Optics.
Fiber
So
Optics, CFO.
talk about your first exposure to Chicago Fiber Optics. Like, what's your earliest memories of this entity called Chicago Fiber Optics?
There were, I have got two memories, or three. One, these people are nuts, right?
I've sort of met a few of them in happenstance, and yeah, they were pretty crazy.
Because to put it in context for your listeners, there's two companies that legitimately could lay claim to being the first company to attempt to compete with Ma Bell in the local loop. MFS was one, and MFS ultimately became the largest. The other one that has a legitimate claim is Teleport. But say it was those two. At the time, this was an insane proposition that we could go and build a local network, which is very, very expensive, and sell services. And I'll exaggerate, $100 a month. I'm like, how does this make sense? This makes no sense. And is anybody going to buy from us? So what I call crazy, they were in some ways crazy, but they were entrepreneurs that saw the opportunity. And like a lot of entrepreneurs, they don't worry so much about the obstacles because they know that they'll figure out a way around those obstacles. So because Kiewit was going to invest in and basically fund the construction or build out, Jim asked me to go over and oversee that work. It turned out I didn't want to go, but I did. And it turned out really, really well. That was like the first life-altering thing that happened to me when we sold it to WorldCom. But by then I was one of the executives at MFS, and there were a number of claims to fame. And one of them is I hired the bear.
That is true.
You weren't called the bear at the time. And my boss had rejected him. He said, he's got a good resume. I interviewed him. He wants too much money. I don't think he's that good. And I had not interviewed you.
Yeah.
And literally it was like 3 days later, I got my boss's job, and my boss went and worked for a different part of MFS. And I called you up, and I think we had you closed within a couple of days or something.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I don't think I ever met Rich Kozak. It was Rich Kozak, right?
Rick Kozak, yeah, right.
Yeah, I don't think I ever met him. Even to this day, I don't recall ever meeting him. Maybe I did in the MFS, but I don't recall actually interviewing with them. But I do recall sending the resume, and back then you did cover letters. Cover letter probably, if we still had it, would say Mr. Kozak.
Yeah. No, that's what you did back then, right? Yeah. So when we sold MFS, Jim, myself, Doug Bradbury, and a few other guys started Level 3. Once we came out of the ground in terms of being that we are actually doing this thing, I think you were the first guy that I called to say, "Hey, we're going to do this thing," and you quickly joined. But so Level 3, I was one of the co-founders and ended up as president COO. I actually was president COO pretty much through the whole time. And COO there included sales, marketing, at different times product. At sometimes it wasn't in there. It was, but for the most part, it wasn't just the operations. It was actually
it was everything.
It was like running everything
business.
but the corporate functions.
Yeah, I mean, Jim focused on strategy and
raising copious amounts of money,
and and he was good at that stuff. Yeah. But he wasn't, involved
he wasn't
in
the operator.
The business.
Yeah. So I left Level 3, done a few things in between. And frankly, I wasn't doing much, and I was getting pretty restless. My mother used to tell me that, an idle mind is the devil's playground. And I never knew what that meant until I had an idle mind. And I'm like, Mom was right, like on most things. So Bill Beans and I were actually playing golf one day, and he got a call from the president of Ericsson North America. and they had secured this contract for a very large search-based business out of Silicon Valley that I'm not allowed to name, that wanted to start building fiber in local markets. And this guy calls Bill and he said, "Hey, you've built networks before. We're really struggling. Would you mind coming down and spending a day with my guys?" And he said, "Yeah, happy to." He goes, "I'm actually sitting with Kevin O'Hara. He's probably built more fiber networks or been responsible for more fiber construction than anybody in the country. Do you mind if I bring him?" He's like, "No, that'd be great." So Bill and I fly down to Plano. We spend a day with the entire team. I'll leave out the bad parts, but in the car, going back to the airport, I had two questions. Why in the world would Google pick a wireless OEM to design and build a fiber optic network? Construction, right? And why in the world would a wireless OEM throw their hat in the ring and think they could do large program management on a network? And it turns out those questions were really right. 18 months later, Ericsson got fired from this contract, having never put a foot of cable in the ground.
But having spent a whole bunch of money.
Bill and I started asking ourselves those two questions again and again and again. And what we discovered is that after the dot-com bubble burst, we had this tremendous growth in fiber construction, and it literally dropped off a cliff. And I've got this plotted out for marketing purposes. And we then went basically into steady state maintenance mode for the next few years. People are adding buildings here, adding buildings there. But we went from 20, 30 billion a year in construction to a couple billion a year in construction. And then it started to ramp again. And today we're spending probably twice as much per year in fiber construction as what we were spending at the peak of the dot-com bubble. The difference being all of it today is funded by people that have real balance sheets, that have real businesses. So Bill and I said, wow, the supply-demand change has really flipped over. The market has gotten, of contractors has gotten very fragmented. We think that today it's a $30 to $40 billion a year market. And there are two companies for sure that do more than $1 billion a year in revenue in that space. So highly fragmented. We went and we raised some private equity money with an intention of rolling up 10 or 15 companies and growing it to 500 million and basically, going back to our roots, designing and building fiber networks. And that's where I am today. I was the co-founder and executive chairman. A couple of months ago, Bill and I swapped roles. So I stepped back into an operating role. So I'm actually the CEO of Congruex today, but very heavily involved with fiber primarily, some wireless and some data center.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, the two big drivers right now of the massive fiber build is, one is building fiber into homes, particularly spurred by government stimulus money and other kind of overbuild type activity. Another one is the big web scale guys who need to build fiber routes to get more to data centers that are off the beaten path. Is that right, first of all? And what other kind of big drivers are of that? So
those are right. And what's interesting, for the existing carriers, a lot of those are waiting for the government funding. In one of the bills that Biden passed, I think the infrastructure bill, he set aside $42.5 billion for building fiber out in rural areas, not as a 100% subsidy, but it's kind of a reverse auction process you go through. So it's a percentage of your overall build, but a percentage that's sufficient to make what was previously uneconomical economical.
Yep.
But that's just getting started. Most of the construction recently has been funded by the very large infrastructure guys. So these are all public. Brookfield has put a ton of money behind a business called Intrepid Fiber Networks. Meridian, another very large infrastructure firm out of Europe, has built out a fiber to the home business in Indiana and is building out to 330,000 homes in Memphis, Tennessee. And all of this is privately funded. G-Fiber, which is kind of Google's now fiber division, they are building like nobody's business. And then there's some others out there, Metronet and some others. The BEAD money is just now starting to come, BEAD being the government subsidy money, is just now starting to get released to the states.
I didn't realize that.
No, not a dollar BEAD has been awarded yet.
Okay.
So, we've done an analysis on what happens over the next 10 years, and we think that this is a very long run. What has surprised me, Dan, and you've brought up AI a few times, We don't know exactly what the impact of AI is on the fiber plant in the US. But Lumen announced recently a multi-billion-dollar deal with Microsoft where they're going to overpull the entire national network with fiber dedicated to their AI apps. And that got everybody's attention.
Yes, it did.
And I have reached out to some of the consultants that track this stuff and the demand side of things. And I've asked them if they can quantify the effect on fiber as a result of AI. And they say, we don't have a really good answer yet. Again, spurred on by that press release, there's a lot of people are curious about the answer to this question. But what we believe is that it is an integer multiplier on the demand side.
Yep.
So right now, you've got the hyperscalers are driving a ton of demand. You've got fiber to the home driving a ton of demand. You're going to see more of that growing as a result of the government subsidies. And on top of that now, we've got that incremental bit driven by AI. We're still in pregame warm-ups on AI. We're not even in the first inning yet. So we don't know how that plays out, but it looks like it's going to be another significant demand piece.
Yeah, it's going to be profound. I heard a lot of people talk about it and try to say somewhat current about it. 2 weeks ago, there was the Dan AI conference in Denver, and Eric Schmidt from Google was one of the speakers. Very interesting, very compelling. Reid Hoffman was there speaking as well. But then I came home that night and watched a new Netflix series, Bill Gates series on AI.
Mhm.
And within episode number 2, I finally started to get at what people are saying. And it was like a jaw-dropping moment. Before it sounded like, yeah, there's always these big technology disruptions. This is legit, but it's just the next one. But then when they were describing what really is happening, it is, I'm not the kind of guy who looks at new technology and says, oh, geez, bad things will happen. We better be careful. I don't know if bad things are going to happen here per se, but we better as a humankind be careful. One of the things they explain, I heard people say this, but it never really made sense to me, but then they explained it again in the first 2 episodes. I haven't even gotten to episode 3 yet. People say that even those who are building these Gen A models don't really know how it works. Like, sure they don't. Of course they know how that works. But then they explain what they meant by that. And I'm going to botch it up to a large degree, but the gist of it is what the software is doing is it's trying to predict what's the best next word after whatever words have already been there. So it's like, okay, that seems like a long way to solve a problem because you have to explore an awful lot of words to find the next best one. But then it learns from why that was the best next word. And it keeps building up to the point where now it sounds extraordinarily intelligent because it's fed, ginormous amounts of data. It does all these iterations to a point where now it could very quickly give you responses that sound like they're really well thought out. And like you said, we're not even in inning 1 of Gen AI. That's all happened in the last 2 years. And where's this going to be 2 years from now? It's going to be monumentally different, let alone 20 years from now. And it's kind of, it's jaw dropping.
So I grew up watching the Jetsons like on Saturday morning, and flying cars, robotic maids, automatic vacuum cleaners, video calls. They were all on the Jetsons in like the 60s or 70s. And pretty much everything that they showed on the Jetsons is now in real life today.
Yep.
20, 30 years after the Jetsons came things like Terminator and like where we get invaded by these robotics that are learning and they take over the world. I hope to God that we don't start to see that play out in real life in 20 or 30 years. And I think there's a very real chance.
I don't think so. I think there's a better chance it plays out in 20 years, not 30 or 40 years.
But at some levels, it's amazing because mankind has always figured out ways to solve really hard problems. But another level, we're talking about a level of complexity that we've never seen before. It's terrifying at some ways.
But the effects on infrastructure, one, I'm still own a good sized chunk of Zayo. And if we were having this conversation about a year and a half ago and the video wasn't playing and the mic was off, I would say, gosh, I wish I wouldn't have rolled that much over. Now I'm like, that might not have been as bad a decision as I thought it was. I think Zayo is going to be is already starting to be a big beneficiary of this.
Yeah.
I have enough insight of what's going on there to see that the trends have changed materially in the last handful of quarters, and it's attributed to Gen AI. And like you said, that's just the beginning. Because right now, most of that demand is being, from a fiber perspective, is being driven by getting fiber to these remote data centers. But that's just like the beginning. As Gen AI starts to have its much broader influence, it's going to show up in in devices and things that are scattered around, and hence drive bandwidth in lots and lots, and lot more places.
So we are building today, and we are bidding on an opportunity that I think we're in a pretty strong position of, to connect with incremental fiber capacity between one of these regional data center complexes that are popping up in more and more places. I'm not going to say who they are or where it is, but it is one of the 10 or 15 largest in the country right now, in terms of, it's not just one company that's there. Pretty much every one of what we used to call the FANGs are there, plus a lot of other people. And we're not talking about pulling cables between these things. We're talking about 46-way 4-inch duct banks, where 7,000 count fiber is in half of those duct banks. Think about that. When we first built MFS, we were putting 72 count fiber, 28 count fiber. Or
Dana would always tell us, no, 12 fibers is enough to get between the suburbs and the city.
When we built Level 3, the inner city network had 144 fibers on it. And everyone thought that we were nuts.
Do you remember when you wanted to put just one conduit in at Level 3, and I came back and said, no, Kevin, we need to put at least 12 in? You remember that?
I don't remember that. I remember Jim saying something like that.
That's finally looking like a great idea.
It's funny.
It took maybe a couple more decades than we thought it was.
Yeah, there was a lot about Level 3 that we got right on everything but the timing. So I don't know if that's kind of like a moral victory or not, but that was certainly
those extra conduits. I mean, they're going to, maybe the new CEO Kate was right to be investing $1 million in stock when it was $1 a share.
Well, I tell you what, Steve Smith, the guy now running Zayo, he didn't realize that they had 12 fibers, or 12 conduits, and a bunch of them were still open. Because at the Cohen conference, I got talking, and he's like, I thought that was ours. He said, I asked my team, is there anybody that could compete with us for this thing? And I don't know if it was a Microsoft opportunity specifically, but he was talking about something that he had recently lost to Lumen. He said, and everybody on my team said, no, nobody has the ability to do this at or close to what it would cost Zayo to do that. And I just started to laugh. I said, well, it's because you got rid of all the Level 3 people. They would have known.
Well, that's I won't get into details here because but now I know the conversation that I had soon thereafter. Now I know what spurred the conversation, and it was you, because that led to a conversation that was a really interesting one. But they would, there was, I'll just say, there was reach out and a set of conversations trying to pick my brain about, okay, tell us what really happened there. What was really built, and why was it built, and how do you see that playing out? That kind of conversation. But yeah, it's like, geez, how would you like to be sitting on a multi-conduit network, most of them empty and available, that hit all the major markets and then some, because we carried that into a lot of the major cities as well.
Yep.
And I also think, from a Zayo perspective, what Zayo maybe has that's more profound is when you get to the metros, lot due to what MFN AboveNet built out. They were doing a similar thing in the metros, just building shitloads of infrastructure, big fiber counts, extra, conduit capacity. And, if you look at the metro, I mean, they're going to have a lot to work with there.
So, can I go back to power?
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
This is something that, again, I'm not sure what the there is, but we are heading for a huge problem, not just in this country, but around the world. Take a step back. Power utilities, they do 30, 40, 50-year power planning, right? It takes you 10, 15 years, at least it used to historically, for you to be able to get sited and permitted to build a new power plant. And that was based on your 30, 40, 50-year projection. And it turns out electricity is highly price elastic. The more you cut the price, the more the demand goes up. but the doubling in price performance was something like every 40 or 50 years. So it's price elastic, but you can't really see it. Whereas in telecom, we're now getting a gig to houses, whereas when you and I were at level 3, we were selling T1s to businesses, right? 1.5 megabits to a business for way more than what you can buy a gig to your house for today. So the telecom industry went through this massive change where we had to become much more dynamic in how we deploy capacity and get much smarter about how we deploy capacity. The electric utilities are truly highly regulated utilities that are on a 30 to 50 year planning cycle. Power demand growth is pretty closely tracks population growth. And due to certain efficiencies, it actually is not quite the same as that. But if you were to think 1-2% growth a year, that's pretty good nationwide. The projections on the demand increase on power plants over the course of the next 5 years is like 8%. I think that number is right. So we're taking an industry that from the beginning of time, has been a linear industry growing 1% a year. I'm just rounding to 1% for simplicity and to make my point, that now is going to be asked to go nonlinear and starting tomorrow. And as an industry, that's just not the way it behaves. So where this new power is going to come from, I don't know. There's a huge push. If you go to a data center conference, there's a huge push on green energy, zero carbon footprint data centers. That's a fantastic goal. Last year, there were 49 coal-fired power plants in the US slated to go offline that did not go offline as a result of the growth in demand as a result of data centers. So these data centers may be buying clean energy, but the coal power plant isn't going away. So, you could argue whether or not, power is fungible, clean air is fungible, but that's how they're kind of meeting the problem today. In Michigan, there is a nuclear power plant that was in the middle of getting decommissioned, that for the first time in the history of the world, they're going to turn around and recommission it. They've got about $1.5 billion set aside to recommission a retired power plant. Microsoft just announced a deal last week. 3 Mile Island had 2 reactors. One of them, almost melted down. And the other one was retired a couple of years ago. Microsoft has cut a deal with the electric company to restart that nuclear power plant in order to meet its demand for a data center. And my guess is they're going to build those data centers on 3 Mile Island or very close to 3 Mile Island, so you don't have to pay the transmission costs, right? That will only go so far until we have a real problem with meeting the demand for, how are we going to power those AI
because your
data centers?
Put your 8% number in 8% over 8 years, 1% a year. If it weren't for AI, with AI, it's 40%, 50%.
It's going
in the near.
The growth in capacity was a couple percent over the course of that. And again, these numbers are directional. But with AI layered on now, they think that the growth rate goes up by like 300-400% over that period of time. And
compounded,
and it doesn't exist.
Yeah, and it's not just the power generation. It's, as you alluded to, how do you get the power to where it needs to be? Now, for the first round of AI, you could locate those data centers in proximity to where this new power will be originating from. But when Gen AI causes the proliferation of but it's really the learning models that are so intensive. I don't know if the distribution of that, I guess no one knows right now if the distribution of that will be a similar phenomena. If there's be thousands and thousands of locations that have gigantic power needs as opposed to, I think you can safely say probably hundreds is where it's going in the near term.
So as a result, you're seeing these new data centers getting built in really weird places. Before you would build a data center where you knew that there was 3 fiber providers, because diversity was, you could build that facility to be, diverse and redundant with on-site power as backup and the like. But nobody wanted to spend all this extra money to bring networks to it. Now, the money to extend networks is the cheap part. So they're locating where there's available power, including at nuclear power plants. There's another nuclear power plant outside of Philadelphia, and I'm forgetting which data center operator. It's one of the big hyper guys. They just bought a few thousand acres from the power utility so that they can build their data centers at the nuke. Now, this nuke is still running. and they're probably going to file for an extension of their license because they got.
Is that the California one?
No, that's outside of Philadelphia.
Right.
So I mean, this phenomenon I think is how people solve the problem. They're going to get super creative
Have
for
you-
a while.
Have you heard of the company?
Got to add more.
Have you heard the company logo, Denver company, with a great name, but a misspelling of the great name? The great name is Caruso. The misspelling is not like Mike Caruso, like Robinson Crusoe. And I just came across them recently. So they started out, and this is they've already raised and spent $800 million on the equity side, plus a bunch of debt, and they didn't even exist about 4 or 5 years ago. So they started out with calling themselves Caruso Energy Systems. So it's about energy, and they figured out ways of taking wasted, excess energy when they would. I'm going to screw this part up, but when you're burning, fuel and it gives methane off, they capture methane and use that to power a data center. So what were they using data center pre-AI? It was for Bitcoin mining. So they were looking for Bitcoins. Well, then all of a sudden they started putting GPUs in those data centers, and started leasing GPU capacity, not to the biggest of the big tech, but that next tier down. And they were just booming on that. Now they're progressing that further, and now the big tech are kind of buying the shell and the power, but they build them and then they ship them to where they sit on the energy supply, whether it's wind farms that are underutilized, oil fields that have the excess leakage, and they're booming. It's crazy.
Well, on one of the other things that's going to come, and you've already mentioned a couple of these guys, but not in this context, is more modular nuclear plants that are much safer and can be where the reactors can largely be built in a very large factory and then assembled on site. There's 3 very prominent ones. One of them is backed by Sam Altman from is it OpenAI?
Yeah. OpenAI ChatGPT is a product.
Yep. The other one is being backed by Bill Gates, and they've got very different business models and different technology. And then there's a third one, and I don't know who the backers are there, but you've got really smart people also recognizing, hey, this is a problem. Right? Yeah. And those guys have a pretty good track record. It's probably only a matter of time before Elon Musk, comes up with some nuclear power plant play. I don't know, but it's going to be really, really fascinating to watch that play out.
There's another company here in Boulder that we are investors in called Radia. Have I ever talked about Radia? So Radia is building the world's largest cargo plane right here in Boulder.
Building the world's largest
cargo plane.
Cargo plane.
Bigger than any cargo plane in the world, and it's designed for a very specific purpose. It's not the only thing it can be used for, but it's been architected for a purpose. That purpose is to carry very large wind turbines from the factory to these remote locations, because the bigger the wind turbine, the more power you could generate. But how do you get them there? You can't ship them in pieces and assemble them. They're too big to put on trains or on trucks. So the kind of wind turbines that find their way inland are smaller and hence a lot less producing of energy. So their plane will carry the ones you typically would see on the coast into Texas and other areas where there's a lot of wind, and make wind generation of energy a lot more efficient. So
even these small ones, have you seen one of the trains go by that have got the blades on them?
Yeah.
For people that haven't, the blades are 2 flatbed cars long, and there's kind of a pivot between the 2 flatbeds. The cradles that hold the blades kind of pivot so as you go around corners, the blades don't snap in half, and it kind of flex. It's fascinating. But these things are massive.
They're massive, but they're a lot less massive than the ones on the coast, because that's as big as you can get them on a train. So they're size constrained. But the wind turbines are being manufactured for the coast and we think of 30% bigger. The right word to use is bigger, not longer, because they are longer, but they're also much bigger from a circumference standpoint, and they just don't go under bridges. So it's not like, well, we'll use 3 flatbed. It's like you can't get them from here to there. That's just a constraint that the wind turbine industry has had to live with, and that's what spurred the development of this. But the funders of this type of business, more likely than not, will be the big tech companies. They're like, okay, yeah, nuclear, that's a potential solution. There's other potential solutions, but this is also could be a big contributor toward creating green energy in these remote locations.
Hey, you mentioned NVIDIA earlier. I'll tell you a funny / sad story about NVIDIA. Dan and I have known each other a very long time.
You're not going to talk about when I sold the stock in 2020.
No. So we've had the good fortune to have known each other before we had kids and to watch our kids grow up. I've got a son that is 31, I guess 32 now, that is a really, really smart kid. And he did 3 internships. He worked for a video processing company in Portland. It was software based. He then went to work for NVIDIA. He was an electrical engineer at Carnegie Mellon, and he thought that would be great. So he got a job at NVIDIA, and then his last job was in financial services before he graduated. And I asked him, and we're talking 10 years ago. Well, what about NVIDIA? Because I thought you were going to really love that. He goes, yeah, at one level I did, but I just don't see them having that much of a future. I think they're very nichey. And the last time we were together, I was asking, because he got an offer from them, and I asked him if he went back and looked at what just the offer was worth, if he had, and that's without any subsequent equity grants. And he's like, yeah, I have. And I think it was 8 figures. This is a kid that's 30 years old. And the offer package, fast forwarding to today, without any other annual grants, would have had him in a pretty nice place.
He could have been taking you on fancy vacations instead of you taking him on them.
No kidding. There's still hope for that, by the way. So.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for those. This is getting way off on a tangent, but a brief one. And it used to be, when we were early in our careers, if you wanted to be successful, things like ambition and hard work were just table stakes. I mean, it wasn't a differentiator. It was like, of course you have to work hard. Of course you have to be ambitious. So what? Everyone around you in many of these circles. Today, based on the good fortune of what's happened during the COVID cycle and stuff, if you're ambitious and you're hardworking as a young individual, young professional, that's a competitive advantage, because a lot of the people who are in your peer group, did not develop, that way of approaching their professional life. And, I think you match that up with the opportunities that are being created by AI and other opportunities around it. Boy, this would be a great time to be launching a career.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think that you and I, there were times in life where we might have viewed it as a disadvantage, but I think in the long run, as we sit here today, it was the ultimate advantage. And we had absolutely no say in it. And that was our parents. Hobbes used to refer to the lucky sperm group. Hobbes is a guy that Neil and I both worked with. So members of the royal family, billionaires' children that have never done anything. And he would always complain that we weren't them. I think that served us way better, because both of us grew up middle class at best, but with really parents that made us work hard and expected us to work hard and expected to give us nothing. I mean, they gave us a lot. I was never hungry or went to school, dirty or without clothes. But they didn't buy us cars, and they didn't do a lot of things, and that kind of motivated us.
Yeah.
I see a huge difference in the kids today. And when I say kids, my oldest ones are in their 30s, and I still call them kids. But whatever that generation is, not everybody has the same motivation. And in some cases, it's good because they have other things in their life. But from a professional standpoint, to your point, if you're smart and you have hard work ethic and you're ambitious, that's a phenomenal combination today, because the opportunities are so immense.
Yeah.
This is a factually correct statement. There has been more wealth created as a result of the finding of the computer than at any other period in the history of the world. And it started with kind of little inauspicious beginnings, with a little crappy company called Microsoft and IBM not knowing what to do with this laptop thing or portable computer. But that gave rise to so many different businesses. And all of these things are the next generation or iteration of what started out like, what are we going to do with these things?
Yep.
I don't know. Well, we found a lot of ways to put them to work.
Yep. That's what's interesting about it. The Gen AI is, and maybe this is just natural, and you can say this during any kind of change, how much faster it's happening than previous ones. Now, you can probably look at the last one and say that was faster than the prior one, but the pace in which things are moving right now and quickly getting to answers to the question that took a long time to get to when the internet came. Like, what are we really going to use the internet for? But what are we using Gen AI? We already are. Lots of people already are using it. Now, having said that, AI has been around for 20 years, so maybe it was one of those things that took 18 years to get to the point where it even mattered, in a material way, and then boom, it's taken off like gangbusters right now. But I mean, what we're going to live through in these next 5 years, and then on top of that, I spent a fair amount of time in the quantum area. Quantum is going to then juice that up further. Now, it might be 5 years from now. It's not going to be a year or two from now at any scale. It's almost like where AI was, maybe 8 to 10 years ago. That's where quantum is now. So a lot of groundwork's going to need to be laid. But at some point, that's going to get, when that gets to a tipping point, it's not going to happen slowly. It's going to happen potentially with the same kind of rapid impact as Gen AI is right now. And that could be as early as 3 years. It could be as long as 6 or 7 years, maybe even longer. But when it happens, it's going to be profound, and it's not going to be replacing AI. It's going to be feeding off of each other. And another area that has been shocking to me, and it sits somewhere in between those two. It's not taken off nearly at the pace of Gen AI is. Nothing is, but it's happening a lot quicker and in equally profound ways as quantum, and that's space tech. And Colorado plays a huge role in space tech, one of the most important reasons for that. But the stuff did you, I just heard today, I didn't have a chance to verify it yet. Have you heard that that Elon Musk has come up with a cell phone now to connect up to his satellites?
I've not heard that.
Now, that's from an unreliable source, although I'm sure it's easy to confirm. But he was talking as if it was a factual statement. I'm like, well, I know that we want to get our phones to be able to talk natively, as kind of an additional transmission method with the what's his communication system called? Starlink. But if he's like, well, screw that, I'm going to have my own kind of iPhone equivalent that only works with Starlink, that would be pretty crazy as well.
That would be really crazy, because guess what? He doesn't have to worry about SITAC for towers.
Yeah, no.
Say what you want. The guy is like a crazy mad scientist type, but he hasn't been wrong,
No.
right? He's got one of those rare abilities to kind of like see around corners. That would be a fascinating addition to his portfolio.
Yeah. How about it? I mean, the stuff he's doing, even outside of the big things that we know about, but planning stuff in people's brains, that kind of stuff. Like, you're doing that too? What are you not doing? I'm sure he's going to roll out something with Gen AI that's profound. There's certainly expectations for that.
So, but on space tech, go back to the Apollo missions when we first went to space, right? Or Gemini. Those things either they didn't go anywhere, or they splashed down somewhere in the Pacific Ocean or somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. And then the Navy would like race over to like scoop them out of the water, right? I mean, they had a decent idea where they were coming down, not a great one. And then we had the Challenger, where they could actually land on a runway, right? They couldn't take off, but they could land on a runway. And we thought that was the craziest thing in the world. Now they send rockets up, they come down and they land them standing up, right? I mean, like, who does that? I mean, think about how smart all of these people involved in all of these ecosystems must be. I mean, this is, to the casual observer, you go, well, yeah, why wouldn't you? But when you get into what it takes to actually pull that off, that is phenomenal. And they will have developed it in probably 10% of the time it would have taken the government to do it under NASA, just the way the government works.
But do you think maybe we can send a person to the moon again at some point? I mean, it's been a few years since we've had a person on the moon. That's pretty crazy. So,
well, I think right now, we send people to the space station on a regular basis. The big thing is we should send them up and hope that we can bring them back on schedule as well. How'd you like to go to space for 2 weeks and end up there for 6 or 7 months?
In this little container.
Oh my God.
Nothing to do other than experiments, whatever that means.
Yeah. Yeah.
your 2 weeks worth of experiments get dragged into like an 8-month.
Yeah.
That must be just crazy. But
what a nightmare.
if you want to be an astronaut, though, I mean, you got to be wired different, because I mean, I'm not going to get one of those little things and get popped into the sky. I don't have no ambition for that.
No, I've done a lot of adventurous stuff in my life. I used to do a lot of crazy stuff. And somebody asked me about either going to space or getting in one of those little subs and going to 10, 20,000
Definitely
feet.
not doing that.
And I'm like, I'm not doing either of those things. Maybe if I was 25 and didn't think it all the way through, I might have. But at this stage of life, no, don't really need to do that.
Yeah. Good deal. So let's go back to some bandwidth memories. Any other like really cool stories that you were part of, came through, people that you came across, big memories?
So I think one of the great untold stories is if you look at, I mean, MFS, if you look at all the people that kind of spun out of MFS and the companies they created, that was pretty impressive. It was really impressive. If you look at the people that left Level 3 and the companies that either they founded or that they took over or whatever, by my estimate, they have created multi-hundred billions of dollars of value. And some of it is well known, some of it is less well known. But when you add up how many people left, I think the group of people that we had at Level 3, I can't compare it to a Google. One, they've got way more and a lot of really, really smart people. But in terms of a phenomenal set of people, when I look back, I'm in awe of all of the people that were there working together. Some working nicely together, some working less nicely together, but everybody was pretty much pulling in the same direction. There was a lot of super type A personalities. They weren't always the easiest to have on your team. But it's just amazing what that group was able to do. In terms of individuals, I've got a lot of great memories, but I also have a list of 15 or 20 people that I worked very closely with, and they ended up in jail, right? And I don't want to go down that list too far, but at WorldCom, those guys all went to jail, and not all of them, but a number of them went to jail. It was a long list of people that were customer of ours or former colleagues of ours that somehow lost their way and crossed the line. And in order to go to jail, you got to be pretty far over that line,
Yeah.
right?
Try to put yourself back in that era. So, we're in late 90s. Everything's exploding. Values being created overnight by dozens of companies, a lot of which don't even have a business. They have a business plan. Things are great. It's 2000. We get through 2000, but then 2001 starts to come in. Now you're in the middle of 2002 and 2003, and the world has just changed dramatically. Can you put yourself in that 2002, 2003 timeframe? Because at that point, it's like probably I guess it's probably unfair analogy to those who actually, have been in a real war where missiles are being fired and guns are being pointed at you, but the fog of the situation was profound. Like you really couldn't tell what all was going on. Can you put yourself back in there and remember, what it was feeling like, and as it was sort of unfolding, but there were so many unknowns around it?
I do, and I'll tell you a great story from that period of time. The first one, in terms to put myself in the frame of mind, as we were going through that, I was invited to sit on a panel somewhere. I don't remember the details of the panel, but I remember it was one of the hosts from Squawk Box or MSNBC or one of those business-oriented talk shows was actually moderating the panel. And again, I'm going from memory. I think it was Scott McNeely from Sun Microsystems at the time was the first to answer this question. There was 4 of us, and the moderator said, "Let me just start and get it out there. Okay, what we're going through as an industry, or what you guys are going through, broadly speaking, as an industry, is devastating. I'm not sure we've seen a shakeout like this and concentrated in one sector quite to this degree before. How are you guys sleeping?" And again, I think it was Scott McNeely. He was a funny enough guy that I strongly think it was Scott. He said, "Well, I'll go first." He said, I don't know about these guys. I'm sleeping like a baby. I wake up crying every 3 hours. And he kind of captured it, right? I mean, it was hard to sleep through the night at that period of time.
Yeah.
We were laying thousands of people off. There was customers going out of business left and right. You just didn't know what you're going to get thrown at you the next day. In the middle of that, in our business, and you were still at level 3 at the time, there was this big push to start doing swaps. And swaps, for those folks that haven't been in the telecom industry, is if Dan has a cable that goes from point A to point B, and I've got one that goes from point C to point D. From the beginning of competition, I'd say, Dan, I'll trade you 2 fibers on my route for 2 fibers on your route. And that works. And that's a swap. But those things would get booked on the balance sheet. Yeah. We just exchanged
and often
assets.
with a legitimate reason for doing it, right?
Very
Certainly
legitimate reason.
Stage, like, I want 2 fibers on that route,
That's
and
correct.
you want 2 fibers on my route. Why go overbuild each other? Let's swap assets for good business reason.
So we that's been around forever. And to Dan's point, they were always done for legitimate business purposes, but it was always viewed as an asset on the balance sheet, and just the character of the asset changed. Somewhere along the line, somebody came up with the idea that, well, why put it on the balance sheet, right? If I could sell that for $40 million and you could sell yours for $40 million, let's sell them to each other for $40 million a piece. And now we get to put it on the income statement, because I'm going to miss my quarterly earnings this time. And I don't want to do that because I'm going to get bludgeoned to death in the market. And everyone's going to question whether I'm going to be here. So let's treat this as income and treat it as revenue, which turned out to be illegal. It got me a couple of quality visits with the U.S. attorney for the Denver office, because we had been offered one of these deals.
Yeah, although let me pause you for a second there. So when we first started to describe it, we said, I need those 2 fibers and you need these 2. Let's do a swap and count it for a certain way. Then you start saying, well, wow, if we could account for it differently, look how much better it looks, an income statement. But then you take the next step and say, does it really matter if we really need each other's fibers? Why don't we do it anyways for the financial benefit, even if we kind of don't really know if we need each other's assets?
And even if there's not really a financial benefit, right? It's very illusory, right? So you're exactly right. The motivation changed from a very legitimate business need to trying to avoid bad news at the end of the quarter. So, we feel this call in the morning. Surreal, in fact, called me, and it was a crazy proposition, but company X is called. This was the last day of the quarter, by the way, and it was a Saturday. I'll never forget it, mainly because the U.S. attorney had all of my phone records and emails. But the Surreal called and said, hey, we have an opportunity to sell this company X amount of stuff and in return buy X amount of stuff from them. And I said, no, we're not going to do that, because it was rumored that this company was doing this as a matter of course each quarter, and it was going to come crashing down at some point. But over the course of that day, we ended up with conference calls with lawyers, with accountants, and the company was panicking because we weren't saying yes. I spoke to their executives 5, 6, 7 times over the course of the day. And by the time evening came around, they were like, you can pick any assets that you want and call it $40 million. And you can pick whatever assets you want to sell me and call it $40 million, but it has to be $40 million. And you can give me shit that you don't need in the corner of New Hampshire, right? And you can take my best stuff. So it was compelling. And we're pushing we're pushing the accountant, saying, if we don't treat it as income and we just treat it as a balance sheet transaction like it always did, would we be clean? And long story short, we could get an opinion from the accountants and the lawyers that if we did A, B, C, D, we would probably be fine. And it was very interesting. And what was really frustrating is Jim was hiking up in the Tetons and was completely inaccessible. And I was not at all comfortable making the final call on whether to do this. Fortunately, around 8 o'clock at night, Jim called me back. I'd left like 50 messages. And Jim, who was a pretty straight down the middle of the fairway guy, said, oh, boy, yeah, I agree. It would be great if we could do that. But let's call Walter. Walter Scott, the guy that I met when I was 19, became the chairman of MFS, and then he became the chairman of Level 3. So Walter was kind of a continuous part of my career for a very, very long time. And Walter was just this good old boy from the Midwest that had Midwestern values, that happened to be great friends with Warren Buffett and happened to make billions of dollars on his own. But he was very Midwestern in terms of
Just
his
happened
approach.
to make billions of dollars. That's when $1 billion meant something.
It did. Yeah. So we called Walter. Now it's 9:00 on a Saturday night. And Walter started most of his answers with, well, it seems to me. Right? So Jim lays out the scenario, asks me to fill in the blanks. I think Surreal was on the phone with us. I think our general counsel was on. And Walter says, well, it seems to me that since you've never called me once in any of this time in telecom to ask me whether or not we should do a deal, you already know the answer and you're hoping that I give you a different one. And
that's interesting. That's a great answer.
And he said, and I said, well, look, this is what we can get an opinion letter, blah, blah, blah. And he said, Kev, when the shit hits the fan, nobody's going to be asking for the opinion letters. The question is, when the shit hits the fan and it's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, how are we going to look and how are we going to react? And are you prepared for that? Because you're going to get painted with the same brush that everybody else is getting painted. And the only way to avoid that is to not do it, regardless of how we account for it. And I think that you guys already knew that, which is why you called. That's why Walter made billions of dollars, right? He was pretty smart also, but he also could cut right to the point. And he was right. And, since I was 19, everywhere I worked, there was an element of guidance that had been, established by Walter. So that was probably as close as we were ever tempted to do something that, again, we would have been very appropriate in what we did. But some other people, they just found it so easy to cross over that line. And we never did. And I remember speaking at another conference where the moderator said, Kev, all of these people have done bad things. They're restating, they're in jail, they're doing this and that and that. And when Level 3 was able to navigate their way through in an amazing fashion. I mean, you still got financial challenges. But in terms of the really bad stuff, it looks like you guys didn't do any of it. What was the secret? And I said, we never thought that not breaking the bar was that high a bar, right? Or not breaking the law was that high a bar. I mean, it just wasn't. But at some point, people woke up and their quarterly earnings were more important than probably they should have been.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and it's amazing. I was, researching and rereading, and not even reading for the first time because we were so busy, obviously, in those years. I mean, busy building what we were building, then busy trying to navigate the tough times. You didn't have the mental ability and the time to kind of see the bigger picture as it was playing out. You saw bits and pieces, but it's not like you step back and say, "Oh, I'm going to take a couple hours and really understand what's going on with WorldCom and with Quest and with Global Crossing and all these other ones." But you reread them in the real time in which they were happening, through Wall Street Journal articles or New York Times articles, and it's like, wow, we could have so easily found ourselves in on the other side of that line if not for really strong leadership. I mean, a lot of us, I was at the level where, I was an execution guy, right? So it was like, go do this and you go do that as best you can. And you try to make things happen. And, I'm not sure I had the full judgment or reasoning that if I was asked to do something like that, well, I was. And like when you were describing the story, I was part of that too.
Yep.
As you remember, you had us starting to work on kind of figure out what assets we would give them that
If we
we
do
could
it.
say is worth $40 million that we don't care if they have, and what assets do we want from them that are really valuable to us. So we had already in that 48-hour period of time, not even 48 hours, we had already started mobilizing the effort and having the phone calls and piecing together what we wanted and what we wanted to give them before it was, before we got word from you guys, stop the work. So we were doing the work and we were doing it with the right mindset. But like you said, that probably wouldn't have mattered at the end of the day if we would have gone forward with that.
Yeah, I mean, the way it played out, Dan, we would have been, to Walter's point, we would have been painted with the same brush. So I don't know that I ever shared with you about my visits to the U.S. Attorney.
No, that's the first I heard.
I'm driving down, and it was an invitation, which when you get invited to go meet with the U.S. Attorney, it's a little intimidating. So I'm driving down with our attorney, and he said, "Look, unless you remember vividly, okay, your answer is I don't recall. You don't want to speculate. You don't want to guess. I mean, it's kind of deposition 101." He goes, and the big thing for you to remember, he goes, you have not been subpoenaed and no warrant has been served, and level 3 has not received any subpoena or warrant. So we haven't given them anything. That does not mean they don't have everything. Because if there was emails involved, there's a counterparty. To the extent they CC'd 6 people, now that means there's 8 copies of it, the sender, the receiver, and those 6 people. You should expect that they have every email that you have ever sent. You should expect that they have your call records received by subpoenaing the counterparties, the person that called you or that you called, their phone records. And boy, was he spot on. They had so many of my emails, so many of my call records. At the end of the second session, the beginning of the first one, the first question is my client a subject or a target? No. Okay. Thank God. But at the end of the discussion that we have with them, my lawyer said, are you guys satisfied? Yeah. What was the basis in wanting to interview Mr. O'Hara? He goes, I'm just curious. And it was a lady, it was the assistant U.S. attorney. And she said, everybody else that we've looked at has done these deals. The only one that hasn't done these deals is level 3. And we want to know why. You were in every one of these conversations. We've got the records. And you always said no. Why did you say no? And I said, we couldn't figure out how they created value for our shareholders. Well, why would everybody else do it? You have to ask them. Oh, we have. And a lot of them got indicted. Some went to jail. Some went to jail for related reasons, not directly for the swaps. Led to a lot of restatement of earnings. But the big thing was, why didn't you guys do it when everybody else was doing it? And again, maybe it's the way I was raised. Maybe it was Jim. Maybe it was Walter. But it just seemed like that was a risk. I mean, why would you risk going to jail over a business deal, right? Yeah. I mean, that just doesn't seem like a good trade.
Yeah, and the jail time that was done by some of them was long. I mean, Bernie Evers practically died in jail. They let him
a mercy release
for the last few months of his life because he had, I don't know if it was cancer, but they knew he didn't have much time to live. So Nacho spent a whole bunch of time in jail, got out. So this wasn't slap on the wrist type of jail time. This was hard time for a lot of these folks, and I would say deserved, because these weren't necessarily bad people, but what they did had horrendous impacts on lots of people. And I'm not talking about lots of rich people. I'm talking about people who were in pension plans and held stock, and all of a sudden it's worth nothing. And it's one thing if you just made some really horrendous business decisions that you should be held accountable for, but maybe not criminally accountable. But there's a difference in bad business decision and fraud. And this was fraud, and a lot of it, as you said, they didn't always go to get convicted on that specific charge, but it was creating the illusion of the financials being strong and then selling their stock while the stock price was high. So it's easier to prove the selling on insider information versus, what were really the complex intentions around these swaps.
Yeah.
Crazy stuff.
I tell you, Dan, that the beginning of MFS was the Wild West, right? It was before the Telecom Act. There was no rules written. And that may have been the funnest time I've ever had in my career. But that shakeout at the end of the dot-com bubble is probably the most formative time of my career, because you can learn so much more from mistakes and bad things. And because you tend not to focus on why did that thing turn out so well, right? But when you see people going to jail and all these other things, you really fixate on that. It was a pretty formative time, and it wasn't It wasn't 2 months or 3 months. It was years.
Years. I mean,
Um,
that's the other thing with the, I shouldn't say the benefit of hindsight. Maybe it's the opposite of benefit. But with hindsight, I mean, could you have ever imagined sitting there now? I'll fast forward to 2005, 2006, 2007. How many years we're going to have to go by before stability really started to show up within industry? I mean, it was years.
Yeah.
Who would have thought it would have taken that long to I mean, the industry dug itself a big hole, and it took a long time to crawl out of that hole.
Well, and part of it is we had dumb money coming in and saying, I can buy these assets for 10 cents on the dollar, right? So those assets started to get recycled, and then they had to
Mhm.
get flushed again, right? Because the operating expenses and operating losses were so high. There was just a lack of appreciation. Everybody thought it was really easy to do what we had done. And it turns out it wasn't that easy. It was actually pretty hard.
Yeah. So if you look forward in time, I was having a conversation with an analyst, and so we know as much as anyone, although if people think about it, it's kind of common sense. Fiber networks, play an instrumental role in all that is happening. Fiber networks are an extraordinarily important part of the value chain. You wouldn't have all these things we have, including Gen AI, if it wasn't for fiber. And the ownership of fiber is very concentrated. Not if you go like to residential neighborhoods and stuff, but the ownership in fiber is concentrated in a way that we always dreamed of. We got to get to the point where the industry is consolidated, then we'll reap the benefits of it. Yet, if you add up the value, the total value of Lumen and Zayo, and then there's a big drop off from there. You have the portion of the business 18, the portion of vision of Verizon. If you could kind of value that, the Crown, business that is, you add all those up, and it's a tiny number relative to the market cap of any one of the big tech companies who are the beneficiaries of the fact that all this fiber exists. What is standing in the way of the fiber companies today in extracting a lot bigger bite of the value chain? I mean, why isn't their revenue double what it is? Why isn't their value triple what it is? It still would be a small number in the overall scheme of things.
I've got a point of view that I'd rather share like offline than on. But if you look at the people that left level 3, most of them after I left, because there was a number of changes in leadership. When Jim was there and I was there, we were pretty singularly focused. I mean, we were trying to be good business people and make sure that we were profitable and had cash flow and all that stuff. But if you say, what was the driver? It was growth and innovation. And then with a lot of these companies, because their balance sheets are out of whack, rather than trusting the growth and innovation to let them grow out of things, they went into massive cost-cutting mode. And when you look at the people that left, they weren't the C players, right? The people that left were the A team. They went and said, I don't want to live in this like cost-cutting world like forever. And they went and they sought out greener pastures. You, in my opinion, you need to be able to tolerate having people like that on your team. I'll give you an example. Grant Van Rooyen. Okay, he started Cologix after he left, sold Cologix, made a ton of dough, is now starting Tract, which is doing amazing things in the data center space and the ecosystem. Grant was not the easiest guy because he was.
Oh, he worked for me. I can vouch for that.
He was.
You made me look not so bad as far as easy to work for. And that's.
But guys like GVR, they're worth the weight in gold, right? Because he was such a creative guy and such a smart guy. And I just cite him as one. There was a bunch of those guys, right? But I mean, he wasn't gonna fall in line easy, and he wasn't gonna say, I want to be the best cost cutter in the world, right? He had a lot of ideas that he wanted to go, and he had the courage to pursue them and put his own money into those things. So when an organization loses all that, and when I look around it, Zayo is a little bit different. In fact, Zayo is a lot different. But on some of the other big guys like the AT&Ts, and I think at some point they just kind of lost their way. And maybe it's just they got fatigued from fighting their balance sheets every day. And Lumen to this day, as much as Kate is trying to progress things, and I don't have a point of view on the path that she's on, but every day is consumed with the balance sheet, right? And I lived that life for a handful of years. It's a miserable way to get out of bed in the morning and go and saying, fighting the balance sheet again today, right? It was just constant. And it gets in the way of innovating. It gets in the way of really focusing on customer. And it gets in the way of really focusing on growth. And I saw a letter that Jim wrote one time, and I can't validate the numbers, and they're not going to be accurate, but they're going to be, you'll get my point. It was, I see, and I forget who he sent the letter to, but you're attempting to increase your market value by cutting cost, and your EBITDA's only growing as a result of cost cutting, and the street will value that at X times EBITDA. That's how they value a dollar of EBITDA growth resulting from cuts. A dollar of EBITDA growth that comes from growth, okay, gets valued at twice that, okay, or 3 times that, depending on the situation. And he had Jim was a pretty smart and analytical guy. He had a lot of basis for this thing.
Opinion. It's definitely true. So I guess you call it opinion, but
he'd quantified it.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, but as basic of a point as that is, not the specific quantification, but the point, it gets lost on people. They're like, oh, this is worth X times EBITDA. It's like, maybe, I don't know, if you're growing at 10% and your EBITDA is growing along with it versus you're flat, that isn't the same multiple. It's not the same multiple.
No. And that was, I just think people have lost their way. And if you go all the way back to, I think it was Michael Friedman wrote the book, The World is Flat. It is like a classic. Basically, he was saying that Indian call centers dislocated certain functions that would have had to have been co-located previously could now be spread out, was all a result of the increase in bandwidth. That the construction of networks like Level 3s and people that were like us around the world, and then the explosion of undersea cables, that's what enabled us to kind of flatten the world. So in many ways, we got screwed because we've enabled all this stuff and we haven't been fairly compensated. Yeah. Although we could look around here and people might argue with that.
It does feel like the value chain got away from us. And, part of it was, we won't get into full discussion, but as I look forward, the question I ask, and I could ask this now because I'm not in industry, so I can't go to jail for asking this question. When there were lots of providers, so lots of alternatives, the switching costs, were not insurmountable. You could switch from one vendor to another vendor, and when you had 6, 7, 8 to choose from on a like-for-like basis, you could get one to play off the other. Now it's harder to do that in many, many, many permutations of locations. So if the current suppliers of bandwidth just kind of paid attention to each other and said, hey, the way I'm going to respond if that person raises their prices, and I'm talking embedded basis, I'm going to respond by raising my prices too, as opposed to saying they raise their prices, I'm going to lower mine to try to steal their business. So you know what? I just had some good revenue growth because I raised my prices, and I'm going to do it again 6 months from now, a year from now, a year and a half. And there's few enough suppliers that, as the cost of overbuilding is dramatically high if you don't have the assets in the ground. But the cost of incremental, is relatively low. But if you don't have, only a few people have the assets, only a few people can enjoy that. So if they just sort of play nice with each other, a lot of the value chain could shift back in the direction of the current providers. So, if any of you guys are listening, stop fighting each other and just get a little bit more of a fair share of the bandwidth pie.
So the last service provider that I ran, that you acquired, we had seen, I won't say precipitous revenue declines. It was the classic J curve kind of. Revenue is going to dip and go down for a while we come in with these new products and new services and our fiber takes hold before we start to grow again. But I had a consultant come to me, and at that time, the conventional wisdom was you couldn't raise prices. And the consultant came and convinced me that if you're smart about it, you can raise prices. So we started to run experiments. And at the end of running experiments, we started to raise prices every month. But we never raised it across the board. We never raised it to an entire customer. But if a customer bought 10 products, we would raise the price on one, but we'd only do it to 10% of that product, right? So it was a small piece of that customer and it was a small piece of the overall product revenue. And we had scripts for the call center. We had save plans of what they were allowed to do. If somebody said, I'm not going to do that anymore, and I keep it. And, we sent out all the bills with these new prices on it. Crickets. We didn't get a single call. So then we tried it again next month with a different product. And then we started to just kind of amp that up a little tiny bit over time. So just little pieces and bits, but pretty soon it kind of flattened out the revenue curve. And it was very unconventional. We had some people on the board that came out of the cable world or owned cable businesses. And they're like, well, this is the way cable does it all the time.
Yeah.
Right now, cable generally was a monopoly, but there were always, once you get your base price, it can only go up. Whereas telecom, it would only go down. I mean, when you think about it, it makes no sense. But I'm glad I'm not in that business either anymore.
Exactly. So very few people have had the influence and impact on my career as you've had. Certainly there's been others who I've gotten inspiration from. There's others who I collaborated with and appreciative of that. But as far as where would I be had we not have spent years together, me working for you, I don't know where I'd be, but I certainly wouldn't be sitting here and having kind of the journey of life that I was able to enjoy. So I want to personally thank you for that. And when I think of you, that's what I think of the most. So
well, I appreciate it. That means a lot. One of the things I take maybe the most pride in, Dan, is when I look around at how many people, I don't want to call it came out of like my coaching tree, but came out from where I was. It's a pretty impressive group of people. And I didn't have the same effect on all of them. But man, if you're going to take pride in one thing, that's a pretty good one. The success of the people that you've been surrounded with all that time. And sounds like we're getting ready to wrap. I'm going to leave with, I've got a ton of funny dance stories. Most of them not fit for publication or with polite crowds. But there is one that is very funny that my wife reminded me of today. Dan and I used to travel together a ton. I had recently been divorced, and I guess I'd been separated and or divorced for 2-3 years, and we were flying into Dallas. And I had previously, when I was in Dallas, I'd made a new friend, and Dan and I are flying in. I said, "Hey, I'm having dinner with a friend tonight. You want to join us?" "Yeah, I'll join you." He says, "What's your friend's name?" I said, "Sam." "Oh, great. Looking forward to it." So we get to the airport and we walk out, and it was my girlfriend at the time, my now wife, of 27 years. And Dan goes, "Oh, it's a friend, not like a friend." And it's like a Sam, like, "No, I'm out." And I said, no, Dan, you should be in. And then when we got married, it was a second marriage for both of us. And it was a very, very small affair. It was direct family and about 6 or 8 other people. And Dan was one of those other 6. So you have been, you've been an important part of my life over that. It's almost, in fact, it's more than 30 years at this point.
Oh yeah.
Which is pretty impressive, actually.
90,
so thank
91. So yeah, 35 years.
Yeah. And to be fair, while you did work with me at MFS and at Level 3, to be fair, you were the biggest pain in my ass of anybody on the team.
I was the biggest pain in a lot of people's ass.
But you also probably did as much or more than anybody on the team as well. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. All right, great.
Thanks, Dan. All right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe on your listening platform. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Kendall Weinberg with support from Courtney Caruso, Emily Reed, and Gibson Siegert.